Oh, Melanie? Oh, there she is. Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, please start taking your seats. The program is going to begin momentarily.
Try to make sure you can see your timekeeper.
Oh, where is it? Where is it?
She should be.
Good evening. Please take your seats. Ready? So she's finished with the standing up your ABCDE, and then we're going to start the dinner, right? Okay. Okay, folks. Please take your seats. Four things I want to say before we have the pre-dinner program, and you don't want to miss this. Number one, this is the largest crowd in the history of dinners for the Southern Center for Human Rights. Number two, a lot of you know I've been busy the last several years and certainly the last several weeks, and I got a phenomenal announcement tonight from Elliot Milstein. I just hadn't heard it before. He told me that on November 6th, Barack Obama was reelected as President of the United States of America. Thank you, Elliot. I didn't know. I had no idea. That's great for refreshing news. Number three, as a result of your interest in what's happening, and I'll say more about Steve later, that this dinner has already raised $300,000. Thank you for making it happen. And number four, we are finally moving from the subtle days of using all sorts of different kind of signs to give signals to where we are. For this dinner, this time, this year in Washington, D.C., the Southern Center for Human Rights, this great Frederick Douglass dinner, we are tweeting live during the dinner. Be careful what you say. Let me just thank a lot of people who are here tonight, some special guests. My name is Charles Ogletree. I'm happy to be the emeritus, finally, chairman of the board of the Southern Center for Human Rights. You're clapping because I'm leaving? Is that what it is? My God. Okay. I also want to welcome here, I think he's here sitting somewhere, former Solicitor General Seth Waxman. Seth? Will Seth please stand so we can recognize? I know he's here somewhere. He's coming, all right. Also, Congressman Ted Deutsch. Congratulations. Judges who held me in contempt with impunity from the Superior Court here in Washington, D.C., The senior member of that bench, and now a senior judge, Judge Truman Morrison. Judge Morrison. Also, right behind him, a former public offender as well, Judge Fred Weisberg. Freddie. Another senior judge and a great lawyer as well, Judge Steve Milliken. A remarkable lawyer who married up, great judge as well, Judge Jerry Fisher. Jerry saying, who paid you to say that? Nobody, Jerry. And finally, a young person who worked at the Public Defender Service and sat on the appeals court in his role as a trial judge as well, and who has a great future ahead. Please welcome Judge Neil Kravitz. In terms of politicians, there's no one who's been more supportive of what we've been doing and proposing legislation that makes a big difference with Southern Center for Human Rights, and we're very glad that he's here. Please welcome our friend and a familiar face here in this crowd, Congressman Bobby Scott from Virginia. Formerly with the White House and now General Counsel for the National Security Agency, please welcome Raj Day. With a great group of folks from the state of California still fighting a good fight. They also the director of the Death Penalty Focus. Please welcome Gene Woodford. The California crew. The dean of the University of Kentucky Law School and a great friend and great supporter of our honoree tonight, David Brennan. Please welcome David Brennan. 84-year-old distinguished member of the Department of Justice and also Legal Services, and was the first boss for Steve Bright in Eastern Kentucky. He and his wife are here. Please welcome John and Jean Rosenberg. If you look in your program, we could not be more pleased with all of the law firms and other institutions and individuals who sponsored tonight's event. All the list is in the program. I hope you have a chance to look at it. And a special thanks to 3 remarkable members of the dinner committee for the Southern Center for Human Rights. Please thank Jenny Sloan, Maureen Del Duca, and Betsy Biven, 3 outstanding heroes. And we're just so happy for people who've traveled from across the country and around the world to be here to celebrate Steve Bright's 30th anniversary with the Southern Center for Human Rights. All those who came to support Steve, now no one will stay seated, please stand so we can salute Steve's troops, the troops of Steve Bright. Stand up. And we have some people who had something to do with Steve being here, and we want to recognize the people who've made a big difference in his life, and he's made a big difference in our lives. We want to recognize Steve Wright's family who are here with us. Will they please stand and be recognized? I know your folks didn't know it, Steve, but you know I'm your little brother. Born 5 years after you. That was me, right? All right. I love Kentucky. Let me now ask all the members of the Southern Center for Human Rights Board of Directors if you would stand, and I will introduce their names. Please, the members of the board, please stand. Betsy Biven Seligman, Mary Broderick, Greg Camp, Michael Kaplan, Angela Monty Davis, Alan Garrett, Steve Hanlon, Bill Hoffman, Catherine Huffman, David Lipman, Andy Lips, Laura Sudiel Lucas, Gary Parker, Alex Rudlin, Virginia Sloan, Brian Stevenson, and our new chair of the board, none other than the great Maureen Del Duca, our new chairman of the board, and our newest, I know Henry, you can stay there, and the newest guy who's been writing about the death penalty for all of his life, formerly with the Los Angeles Times, and a brand new board member. Please welcome Henry Weinstein. And I want to thank all the members of the Southern Center for Human Rights staff who've done a great job to make this happen. And I just want us to just recognize the entire board. This is an amazing group of people who are here. There are a couple who are not here. Palmer Singleton could not be here, and Patricia Hale is not here. She's keeping the office buzzing while everyone else is here enjoying this great dinner. But I'd just like the people to stand as I introduce them. A member of the great board of the Southern Center, President and Senior Counsel Steve Bright, Executive Director Sarah Tatanchi, Managing Attorney, Capital Litigation, Raul Schonman, Managing Attorney in Impact Litigation, Melanie Velez, Sarah Garrity, William Montrose, Jerry Weber, Tarika Redfield Ganzi, Atiya Holly, Patrick Mulvaney, Jessica Oates, Ryan Pilamarano, Sarah Forte, Mary Sidney Kelly, Jarek Murphy, Christopher Preston, Lachlan Rosen, and of course the inimitable Mary Sinclair. A great senior staff including Renee Myers, Julia Robinson Hicks, Catherine Hamuda, Deanna Green, and of course, who could forget the person who made it possible for this great dinner to happen? She's always working overtime and making this a great event. Let us really celebrate the great work of the development director, Barbara Horwitz. So this is a chance where you all get a chance to at least talk about Steve in terms of how you know him in one respect or another. So I'm going to have 6 different groups stand and recognize either their relationship with Steve, or at the PDS or at the Southern Center. Those who previously worked at Southern Center for Human Rights, please stand and be recognized. Previous employees at the Southern Center for Human Rights. I see them standing. There we go. Those who have been or are students of Stephen Bright, please stand. Now, you may have already stood, but those who served, you can stand again, as Southern Center for Human Rights law clerks or interns or any other capacity, investigators, all those roles, anyone who ever worked there, please stand and be recognized. And those who are currently on the staff of the Southern Center for Human Rights in any capacity, please stand and be recognized. Stand again. And finally, the Kentucky Express, please, those who are family members of Steve Bright, please stand, be recognized. As I said, we're going to be tweeting throughout the night, and I have a couple of tweets that have already arrived. People tweeting should use the hashtag, the pound Steve Bright 30, pound Steve Bright 30. And we have a note from Diane Russ Tierney and the National Coalition to Abolish the Death Penalty. Steve, congratulations and thanks. The National Coalition applauds your vision, leadership, and success in making our world better. We also have one from a good friend of Steve's, Adisu Demisi, is that pronounced right? Steve Bright is my hero, and he should be yours too. Congrats to Steve. Dick Dieter in the Death Penalty Information Center. Dick is here, I think. Where's Dick? There you go, Dick. Steve, from all your friends at DPIC, where would we be without you? Congratulations, exactly right. And this is a very important one. To Steve Bright, this is from Steve Hall and the Stand Down Project. What an incredible institution you've built. You've lived the entreaty, justice you shall pursue. All the best, Steve. And very important from Alan Mills, the Southern Center, amazing 30-year record of struggle to bring justice to our criminal justice system. Here's to many more, Steve. And finally, Steve, you know, this is MS Hillary. To you, thanks for being a troubadour of truth. And Steve Bright and the center has represented a family member for her, and that shows the length and depth and breadth of his scope. We're going to have dinner now and come back with some more of these salutes later on. And we're going to have a song as well from the great Gilda Daniels that you'll have a chance to see. But before we get into that, and Steve, I have to say that it's supposed to be a tribute to you, but I'm looking at some of these names. It seems like it's going to be a roast, man. I don't know. You didn't select these people. I don't know, but we'll see. And I'm not going to talk about your only suit. It's just not fair. I know you have two suits now. Oh, there I go again. Right. Enjoy your dinner. We'll be back in a half an hour and get going with the rest of the program. Okay, we're ready to get going. Is there any consensus? Did people enjoy their dinner? Please thank the staff here. Fantastic dinner. We're about to have a very special treat for all of you. You can see in the program what we're trying to do. I wanted to introduce really a phenomenal lawyer. Gilda Daniels worked at the Southern Center for Human Rights, worked on death penalty cases, graduate of NYU Law School, was also a Ruth Tilden Scholar, has been working in the Department of Justice, Civil Rights Division, voter protection, and because of her, thousands of people around the country were able to actually vote in 2008 and 2012. That's what it's all about. It's our clients that people think won't come, won't serve, and won't vote, but in fact, Gilda made sure that that happened, and now she's going to set the right tone for the evening with a wonderful gospel rendition that you will certainly enjoy. Please welcome to the stage Gilda Daniels.
Good evening. Okay, I'm the daughter and granddaughter of Baptist ministers. So when I say good evening, you're supposed to say, good evening. Oh, very good. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here with you tonight. Congratulations, Steve, for 30 wonderful years. I hope you would characterize them as such. Again, I'm honored to be here with you tonight. And this song is said to be Dr. King's favorite song, and I think it's appropriate for this evening. If I can help somebody as I travel along, if I can cheer somebody with a word or a song, if I can show somebody that they are traveling wrong, then my living will not be in vain. My living will not be in vain. My living will not be in vain. If I can help somebody as I travel along, then my living will not be in vain. If I can do my duty as a good woman ought, if I can bring back beauty to world abroad, if I can spread love's message as the Master taught, then my living shall not be in vain. My living shall not be in vain. My living shall not be in vain. If I can help somebody as I travel
My. Gilda Daniels. One more time, Gilda Daniels. Now I know how she got those thousands of people to vote. My God. Yeah, you got my vote. No question about it. Well, this is the moment we've been waiting for to see the incredible impact that Steve Bright has had on all of us over more than 3 decades. And actually more than 4 decades in terms of practicing law and what he's done as a lawyer to make a big difference. He's always been committed to the same focus of trying to ensure justice in jails and death penalty, other cases as well. So we have 5 people, and you have their bios in the program, and I'll just ask them to come up. Making the case for judicial independence, Judge Penny White. Judge? From the courts of the community, the reach of Southern Center for Human Rights Litigation, George Kendall. Promises to keep, creating Georgia's public defender system, Sarah Tatanchi. Inspiring students and new generations of lawyers, C.S. Sana. And of course, shining a light on Southern justice, SCHR's testimony at the Capitol, Congressman Bobby Scott. So they each will give their own perspective on Steve and what he's been able to do.
Thank you, Charles. Thank you, Southern Center for Human Rights, for this wonderful event and this humbling opportunity, and for continuing to draw attention to the important topic of fair and independent courts. And thank you, Steve Bright, for allowing me not only to know about you and about your life's work, but most importantly, to know you. To understand the magnitude of the impact that Steve Bright and the Southern Center for Human Rights has had on the issue of judicial independence, you really have to take a big eraser to the last 2 decades of history. Because when Steve Bright started the conversation about judicial independence, unlike today, nobody was talking about it. Judicial independence was little more than a historic artifact. Steve Bright started the conversation, and as is true of everything he does, he would not and he has not backed down. In a small way, history is partially responsible for Steve's initial fretting about judicial independence. Consistent with this beautifully framed calligraphy that I once saw in his office, I imagine that in the 1980s, when Steve first started working at the Southern Center for Human Rights, he was like the parable of the starfish. You've all heard the story. It's about the young boy who's quickly throwing starfish back into the water, desperately trying to save them. And when the futility of his efforts is pointed out to him, he replies, "I may not save them all, but I'll save this one." That was Steve in the early days of his career, I imagine. He was doing incredible work. He was saving clients one at a time, but he was in turmoil about the state of our criminal justice system. He was witnessing firsthand the judiciary politicized, from the ousting of 3 Supreme Court justices in California to all too frequent judicial overrides of life sentences in Alabama. So I imagine that what Steve did was some version of what some versions of that parable talk about. He fretted momentarily, but then he charged upstream to determine the root of the problem. And when he got there, he found a crack at the very core of the criminal justice system. He found that the prospect of standing for election was influencing judicial decision-making, that prosecutors were assuming some judicial functions, that financial interests were destroying the integrity of the judiciary, and that the public doubted the fairness and impartiality of our courts. And yes, he feared the impact on his individual cases, but he also feared the impact on the rule of law. But if history deserves partial credit for Steve beginning the conversation, Steve deserves complete credit for the nature and the extent of the conversation that followed. In articles, in books, in speeches, and before Congress, at every opportunity, Steve Bright reminded us and warned us about the threats to judicial independence. He brought to the surface that percolating tension between the constitutional guarantee of equal justice under law and the practical realities of becoming and remaining a judge in the death belt. He challenged the misconception that judicial elections could be reconciled with due process, and he revealed the danger that the public sentiment surrounding capital punishment could overwhelm even judges with good intentions. He dared speak the inevitable truth that elected judges are more likely to sentence a defendant to death than a jury who hears the exact same evidence, that some judges protect their paychecks and pensions rather than protecting individual rights. He exposed common judicial practices that ridiculed the separation of powers, revealing that some judges were delegating core judicial functions like case assignment and docket control to prosecutors. But in Steve Bright fashion, he did far more than call attention to systemic flaws. He outed individual judges who were, in fact, the cancer of the justice system. He named names. Judges who referred to sentencing defendants to death as doing God's work, or who campaigned on platforms promising greater use of the harmless error doctrine. Judges who traded assignments on capital cases so that their buddies could appear on television during election year. And it was this exactness of his revelations that made them so compelling. But Steve did not stop after identifying the offenses and offenders. He offered partial solutions. He called for selection reform. He proposed mechanisms to deal with unfair attacks on the judiciary. And he challenged lawyers and journalists and politicians to educate citizens about the importance of an independent judiciary. He asked judges to undertake serious self-reflection. He urged the judiciaries to assign high-profile cases to out-of-district judges. He advocated judicial recusal reform. Ladies and gentlemen, 3 decades, 3 United States Supreme Court cases, and countless ABA study commissions later, bar associations still struggle to create rapid response teams. Former Supreme Court justices travel the country urging us to educate our citizenry, and states struggle to devise recusal standards. Even as Steve made suggestions, he warned us. In the early 1990s, in his words, he said, "Things may get worse." He cautioned about the growing influence of special interest groups and the corruptive power of money in judicial elections. He alerted us decades before we experienced the now all too common buying of state court benches. And in addition to his prescient revelations about money and special interest influence, he predicted too, years before Republican Party of Minnesota versus White, that encouraging judges to speak freely about their personal political views would not only further reduce public confidence in the courts, that it would also weaken the caliber of those who sought judicial office. If ever a person lived up to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s measure of a man, it is Stephen Bright in his fight to help us attain judicial independence. Dr. King said that the ultimate measure of a man is not where he stands in moments of comfort and convenience, but where he stands at times of challenge and controversy. Steve stands in the uncomfortable position of having spoke the unspeakable, that we are often hiding behind a legal fiction that our courts are fair and impartial, when all too often they simply are not. I'll close with one of my favorite stories about Steve, and it involves a situation in which Steve literally stood for fair and independent courts. When Amy Bach was researching her book, Ordinary Injustice, she and Steve were in a crowded courtroom in Georgia, struggling to hear a judge conducting the business of the court. When Amy suggested to Steve that she couldn't hear the judge, Steve told her to ask the judge to speak up. And Amy said kind of what I would say, no, she's the judge. It's her court. Well, Steve, who's never, ever afraid, because he knows that society's punishment is small compared to wounds that are inflicted on our soul when we look the other way, asked the judge to please speak up. When the judge demanded that he step forward, he stood tall and he declined her offer, almost as if she were offering him a glass of sweet tea. And he said, "No, ma'am, that's fine." But then he lectured her. He said, "We are all here missing work. We've left our children in the care of others, and we want to hear what's going on in court today. You are denying us our right to listen to a public hearing, so please, Judge, speak up." Steve knew, he's always known, that justice cannot flourish behind closed doors, in private whispers at the bench. When I hear that story, when I relate it, I can't help but have hope. Steve and the Southern Center for Human Rights have stood firm and resolute on the issue of judicial independence for more than 2 decades. As long as Steve Bright remains standing, as long as the Southern Center remains vigilant in its mission, we can all dare to believe that the promise of fair and independent courts may someday be fulfilled. Thank you, Steve.
Good evening, everyone. I have 7 minutes max to speak about all of Steve's litigation achievements. From his years at Apple Red in Kentucky, at PDS and at the DC Law Students in Court program, Steve learned all the ropes of a great litigator. And with his commanding voice, his flock of red hair, and dogged adherence to the first rule of success of all great lawyers, preparation, he won cases and worked out deals that eluded the rest of us. During these same years, he also embraced the view, one celebrated far too little today by our profession, that lawyers in America cannot look away from our brothers and sisters who so desperately need our assistance simply because they cannot afford to pay. When Steve was asked to leave his home in D.C., a place he's loved, and his many friends here, and take on the new American death penalty in the not-so-new South, he did not look away and never has since. It is a good thing that Steve was so skilled and prepared for anything when he arrived in Atlanta in the summer of '82. The Southern Center, then the Southern Prisoners Defense Committee, was broke, but scores of condemned indigent inmates faced execution and needed the center's prompt assistance, and complaints about horrific prison conditions were increasing. During those years, Steve had no choice but to spend lots of time not on litigation, but raising money to pay the rent and keep the lights on. He devoted an extraordinary amount of time to helping volunteer lawyers, some of you in this room tonight who'd volunteered to take a case, but some who knew so little about post-conviction law, they spelled habeas with a U. And through all of this, he found a way to provide his clients with exceptional representation. It didn't matter what court Steve was in. With Palmer Singleton, he led the center's defense of Marion Pruitt in a Mississippi state trial court. It was not a plus for Stephen Palmer that Pruitt's nickname was Mad Dog. They won a life sentence. He was the lead lawyer in the William Brooks case in 1991 in Georgia. William was young, African American. Jeannie Galloway was a much-loved, attractive young white female. And the evidence very clearly showed an abduction, sexual assault, and murder. Steve's closing argument was so affecting, it drained jurors the impulse for revenge. The jury returned a unanimous life sentence within an hour. Steve was equally comfortable and effective in the appellate courts. In 1988, he stood before the Supreme Court in Amadeo versus Zant, a race discrimination case in which the 11th Circuit had denied Tony Amadeo relief. He and Palmer and Robert McGlasson wrote very persuasive briefs, but Steve's oral argument sealed the deal. Amadeo won 9-0. Justice Blackmun would later say Steve's argument that day was the finest argument the entire term. And 20 years later, in 2008, he returned to the court in Snyder versus Louisiana and argued a Batson claim, another claim that's difficult to win in appellate courts because trial judges' rulings must be viewed with considerable deference. Steve's very persuasive argument there and often humorous answers to the justice's questions dominated the day. Snyder won 7-2. If I sat down right now, the brief and terribly incomplete view of Steve's extraordinary litigation career would surely justify our warmest and deepest felt praise. But now, this is the important stuff. Steve's litigation legacy reaches far beyond his own docket. He has had a transformative influence on increasing significantly the availability of talented, committed, and independent advocates for indigents throughout the South and elsewhere. And his legacy grows every year. His stand on first principles way back in the early 80s, he was one lawyer unwilling to look away, and a great sacrifice, standing up for injustice, he inspired many others. Bob Moran, who is here tonight, would not let Steve drive that U-Haul from D.C. to Atlanta alone, and stayed with Steve in the center for 18 months. He made a critical difference to the center's financial health and steadiness and helped several clients win relief. Bravo, Bob. Russ Cannon also came along and spent a year there and provided indispensable representation to several clients. And many of you in this room took Steve's call and took cases and provided enormously effective representation. And Steve has always been grateful for that and thankful. Steve's example and the promise of working with him at an independent litigation center attracted other enormously talented and committed allies. Brian Stevenson, our keynote speaker, left Harvard, came to the center, learned his skills, founded EJI, a remarkable not-for-profit, and today is a national, international human rights advocate without peer. Clive Stafford Smith from Columbia came and worked for the center for years, and after learning the ropes, went to Louisiana, which had terrible problems, started the Louisiana Crisis Litigation Center, and after putting it on firm footing, went back to England, formed Reprieve, another not-for-profit, and now represents persons facing the death penalty all over the world. Ruth Friedman, who is in DC now, directly from Yale, came to the center, learned her skills, signed up for a second tour of duty with Brian in Alabama, spent years there, and currently now is still in the game as the director of the Federal Habeas Corpus Project. Bravo, Ruth. They were all brought into this work by Steve and his example. Steve's success at building the center into a solid and influential litigation and policy shop proved that not-for-profit organizations, because of their independence, are uniquely positioned to litigate criminal justice and prison issues aggressively as well as call out offensive and outrageous government policies and practices. Imagine for a moment what would have happened in Georgia and Alabama and Louisiana these past decades had not been for the Southern Center for EJI and for the Louisiana Crisis Center. There would have been a bloodbath in those states and throughout the South. Finally, the extraordinary center that Steve has built, and which presently is in the finest of hands with Sarah, has continued to attract wonderfully talented staff that continue to take on some of the most difficult issues of the day, in addition to capital punishment that deny our poor neighbors basic human rights. The center's work on behalf of HIV prisoners in Alabama was inspirational and brought relief where it was so needed. It's exposing that we have debtors' prisons in this country today has cast a proper spotlight on shameful practices. Its challenge to the most extreme sex offender law in the nation in Georgia, one reform of a terrible, terrible law. These were wonderful things that the center has done. And Steve, I know that you have to be enormously proud of this courageous and effective work by center lawyers on these very difficult issues. It is written in Scripture that tribulation produces perseverance, and perseverance character, and character hope. Well, let me tell you, the arc of Steve's career in litigation has included a boatload of tribulation and perseverance. But it molded Steve's character and has produced so much hope for so many. When you take it all in, it is hard to imagine another lawyer in Steve's generation who has, against such tough odds, increased access to effective and committed advocates for so many indigent people. So Steve, thank you for your first 30 years, and we wish you great health in the next 30. We are all delighted and honored to be here this evening and to have the opportunity to thank you and pledge our continuing support to the Southern Center for Human Rights. Thank you.
Good evening. Steve asked me to ask everybody to talk about the Southern Center, not just him. I just want to put that on the record. And I know, Steve, as I see you sitting over there, I know it's a little bit hard to have this light shine so bright on you, but we are all so thrilled to be here doing this. And thank you. Thank you for giving us the opportunity to shine this light. The story that I'm going to tell tonight is about an ongoing journey, but it's a journey that includes a miracle. And that miracle was the creation of the Georgia Public Defender System in 2003. As recently as 10 years ago in Georgia, our indigent defense system was defined by shameful practices that affected thousands of Georgians in hundreds of courtrooms. In many Georgia courtrooms, to this day, the kind of justice poor defendants get is nothing short of a crime. In some places, we see groups of 100 people or more who were and this was in the old days, who were represented by contract attorneys who would enter guilty pleas that were negotiated in the hallway just moments before. In other places, people accused of crimes were simply never appointed lawyers and instead instructed to go talk to the prosecutor. And in addition to the numerous constitutional violations, the system was downright humiliating to those involved. For example, in open court, judges would make people prove just how poor they were before appointing them lawyers. In one incident, a judge pointed out a necklace that a woman was wearing, asked her how much it cost, and suggested that she sell it rather than leave her burden to the taxpayers of Georgia to pick up. And there were also truly tragic results for some of the most vulnerable community members, including those facing the death penalty. I'll never forget standing outside Jackson Prison in Georgia as we executed Curtis Osborne, a man who was sentenced to death because his lawyer never, who was carrying 600 cases at the time he was representing Curtis, never conveyed the plea offer from the D, and in fact told another lawyer that he believed that that little N-word deserved to die. This was his lawyer. After seeing case after case like these examples, Steve Bright decided that if we are ever going to make any progress in Georgia, it was time to start filing lawsuits. Through on-the-ground investigation in courts throughout rural and urban Georgia, we identified the worst offenders. We first sued in Sumter County in South Georgia and then followed that with a lawsuit in Atlanta's Fulton County. We strengthened the litigation by releasing report after report that detailed our observations. We spoke in churches, in community groups, anywhere where they wouldn't kick us out. We forged coalitions with unlikely and sometimes very reluctant allies. We crashed state bar meetings to individually lobby lawyers who would add strength to our call for reform. By 2001, there was a Georgia Supreme Court Commission on Indigent Defense that was charged with conducting an in-depth study of our system. We filled the commission's room with former defendants and family members of people who were still sitting in jail. And for those who couldn't come, Steve Bright spoke, and he recounted their stories for them. But it seemed like the commission still needs some convincing, so we decided to bring another lawsuit, and this time it was in Coweta County. The Coweta case was a true smorgasbord of constitutional violations. The judge routinely ordered people to negotiate pleas with the prosecutor, and people accused of crimes waited for months before seeing a lawyer. I'll never forget when we announced this litigation on the steps of the Georgia State Capitol. We were flanked by civil rights leaders, including our hero, Dr. Joseph Lowry. Steve made it clear at that moment that this lawsuit would mark the beginning of the end of Georgia's pitiful system. And he announced to judges and elected officials across the state that the Southern Center is ramping up our campaign, and we are coming to a courthouse near you. From there, we sued Fulton County twice more, and then during the 2003 Georgia General Assembly, we sued once again, and this time in the four-county circuit of Cordele. I will never forget the day that from the well of the Georgia House of Representatives, the chairman of the Judiciary Committee spoke in favor of a comprehensive bill that would create for the very first time a public defender system in Georgia. When he spoke, he brandished a copy of our lawsuit, and he warned his colleagues that if they didn't act now, Georgia faced inevitable oversight from the federal courts. It was at that moment that we knew we won. Ultimately, it was Steve's unrelenting agitation that brought this issue to the forefront in Georgia. And in fact, just a little piece of history, Steve was named Agitator of the Year by our I wish we had time to blow this up really big and carve out the face so we could all take pictures pretending to be Steve out in the lobby. Next time, 40th anniversary. But it was Steve who brought a sense of urgency to the reform. He was often referred to in the press as a firebrand, and he brought an uncompromising insistence that we step away from the embarrassing target of mediocrity and shoot for the stars, not the floor. Not everyone in Georgia liked him, but no one could ignore him. 10 years later, the Southern Center continues to log many hours watching court and documenting the challenges faced by people accused of crimes who cannot afford lawyers. While the public defender legislation was a major step forward, the system has yet to see remotely adequate funding, resulting in overwhelming caseloads carried by public defenders who have to struggle for every single resource needed to appropriately represent their clients. When we see particularly egregious miscarriages of justice, we are still not shy about litigating. Since the creation of the new system, we have brought and settled 3 additional lawsuits. My colleagues spend countless hours documenting complaints and violations, monitoring settlements, and negotiating for each inch of progress that we make. But I promise you, we are making progress. When the Georgia Indigent Defense Act of 2003 was signed by Governor Sonny Perdue, a Republican, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution wrote that a new law that would revolutionize the state's criminal justice system would be an accomplishment under any circumstances. In this particular situation, its passage verges on the miraculous. For his leadership in transforming Georgia's indigent defense system, tonight we honor our very own miracle worker and agitator, Steve Bright.
Good evening. I'm so deeply honored to be here today to talk about Steve Bright, his legacy as a teacher, his role inspiring the next generation. And you don't have to look far to see an example of Steve's legacy, because I certainly would not be standing here today were it not for Steve's amazing work. I would not have gone to work at the Equal Justice Initiative in Alabama to defend folks on death row and other poor people in the criminal justice system. And I certainly would not have dedicated my life to the causes Steve espouses. I know this room is full of former students, of Steve's at Yale and elsewhere, many of whom are doing fantastic work for equal rights all over the country. But for those of you who have not experienced Steve's teaching, I think it's only fair to give you just a little taste of this experience. And I can do this quite easily because Steve's students were so inspired by him that not only did they learn a lot about the death penalty and Supreme Court law, they cataloged his wisdom. And I'm just going to share a few lines. These are things Steve actually said in his class at Yale Law School, just so you can have a sense of what his students have been experiencing all these years. Regarding the Ninth Circuit, it's like ducks at the county fair. The Supreme Court is just shooting them down one at a time. Regarding the state of habeas law, the chances that someone on death row is going to file his own petition and litigate it successfully are about as good as me going up to Hartford right now, getting in that airplane, and flying it to Atlanta myself. Regarding the allocation of resources in Virginia, Virginia was using its money, I guess, to maintain its Confederate monuments. Regarding Southern culture generally, I said, Chief, everybody has a Bible and a gun, and they're in the glove compartment, so they're handy. Regarding legal scholarship, law professors love to write articles about how we should get rid of peremptory strikes. Yes, indeed, it's a non-starter. Regarding a judge, he said he wanted to spend more time with his grandchildren, which I find a little hard to believe. He's such a mean, hateful man. I can't imagine he wants to spend more time with his grandchildren, and I know his grandchildren don't want to spend any more time with him. And my personal favorite, also regarding a judge, oh yeah, that judge was a real horse's ass. These are clearly humorous, and keep in mind I just selected statements from just one semester, so there's a lot more I could do here. But it's clear that Steve's inspirational style has inspired his students not just to absorb vast amounts of criminal law, but to catalog his wisdom, which makes this an impossible task, to try to distill this amazing person's qualities as a teacher into just a few minutes, but I'm going to try. So here are three of the biggest ways that Steve inspires. First, charisma. Steve brings the law to life. He does this with his Kentucky charm, his trial lawyer swagger, brilliant legal mind, magnetic personality, wildly creative similes, and that booming voice filled with warmth. But more than this, he teaches us that the law is what happens in people's lives. He enlivens his classes with stories of real people in real courtrooms, in real prisons, facing real challenges, in need of a lawyer to stand with them and for them. And in doing so, he teaches us that the law is not some cold, abstract casebook. It is the ugly, brutal experiences of the oppressed, but also the triumphs that are possible when we stand up for one another. The second quality is commitment. Steve is an unbelievable lawyer, but also a phenomenal mentor. The same fierce commitment Steve brings to his clients, he brings to the students who are willing to go the extra mile in pursuit of justice. There are dozens of former students here working in public defender offices, fighting on behalf of those facing the death penalty, battling to end racial discrimination and unfair treatment in the criminal justice system. All of them taught and inspired by Steve. I'm one of those people. I owe my life in the law to Steve, He didn't just light the fire in me when I was a student in his clinic and his classes. He went a step further and cornered Brian Stevenson in a parking lot, physically cornered him, and convinced him to interview me for a job at the Equal Justice Initiative. And I won't effuse about Brian here, but the magnitude of that opportunity is beyond anything I could ever express. Third, Steve teaches us to follow our conscience. Since I've returned to Yale, I've had the privilege of teaching with Steve. I've seen this up close, and I've seen with amazement how a whole new generation of lawyers is inspired and affected by him. Besides teaching, when Steve is at Yale, he is firing uncomfortable questions about bad lawyering at state Supreme Court justices, who, by the way, thought they were visiting Yale for a conference, not a deposition. Steve was voted by the students to be their commencement speaker, a reflection of the vast esteem in which he is held by the student body. And he used his platform to challenge students with a message they don't hear enough at Yale, to seek justice rather than money, power, and prestige. Steve has never shied away from being controversial and from speaking truth to power, which is why many of our students have taken to calling him the conscience of the Yale Law School. And this is the greatest lesson he has taught me and taught so many of us, to follow our conscience. Over the years, I've spoken to so many people with different motivations and career paths, all of whom were moved to act because Steve's teaching prompted them to follow their conscience. The instincts were there, but for so many of us, it was Steve's teaching that challenged us to do the hard thing and gave us the courage to go not where we could make the most money or have the most power, but where we could make the biggest difference. It's truly remarkable to look out into this audience and hear one person's impact in this field and in the world, really. So the best way I could explain it is that Steve echoes. His booming voice echoes. It echoes in our minds and our hearts, and it reminds all of us that if our clients and their families can persevere in the face of tremendous adversity, brutality, humiliation, racism, unfairness, we cannot be afraid to listen to our conscience and to stand up for what is right, even if it means, to borrow one of Steve Bright-isms, sometimes being the skunk at the garden party. So I'm so honored to have been Steve's student. I'm humbled and moved to call him my very, very, very dear friend. Congratulations, Steve, on 30 unbelievable years in the law, and here's to 30 more. I know you have it in you. And there are literally hundreds of future students and clients whose lives remain yet to be changed by your example, your mentorship, and your teaching. So congratulations.
Good evening. Steve, everybody has talked about your life starting as if you started as a lawyer. I'm going to tell the Steve story. It started while he was a student in college. He had a part-time job at a big historic church, so historic that the organ needed somebody to pump the air to make the thing work, and that was Steve's part-time job. He pumped the air. And one day, a great musician showed up and announced to the audience that I will now play Mozart's concerto in B flat. And he hit the keys, nothing. He looked over, Steve was there. I will now play Mozart's concerto in B flat. Hit the keys, nothing. He stared at Steve. I will now play Mozart's concerto in B flat. Hit the keys. He went over to Steve, said, "Sir, when you going to start pumping the air?" And Steve looked up casually and said, "I'll start pumping the air when you tell the audience that we will now play Mozart's concerto." I say that because I'd like to introduce the staff on the Judiciary Committee, Ashley McDonald, and Bobby Vassar, who you know is a longtime senior counsel for the minority. Ashley and Bobby along with Ted Deutsch, who's already been congressman from Florida, has already been recognized. I'm very pleased this evening to honor Steve Bright to celebrate his 30th anniversary at the Southern Center for Human Rights. When Steve agreed to move from Washington to Georgia to become the director 30 years ago, he was agreeing to head up an organization that had only one full-time attorney, daunting caseload, and has been pointed out, was broke. I understand it was so broke that his first month there, he had to pay the rent on the building out of his own pocket. So after 30 years of leadership, the center now is staffed with more than 10 attorneys, in addition, investigators, finance director, policy coordinator, administrative assistant, and taking cases all over the country. So after 30 years, Steve, look what the center has brought. Hundreds of defendants, both on trial and appeal, and has literally been as you've already heard, the difference between life and death amongst many clients. Now, Steve has been very influential, not only teaches death penalty, writes influential articles, not only about the problems with the criminal justice system, but particularly racial discrimination in the justice system, and has been an invaluable witness for congressional hearings in both the House and the Senate. Steve doesn't know this, but I was in the state Senate 20 years ago when all of the members of the state Senate who opposed the death penalty, all of us got together, better known as both of us got together, and worked out a deal with the other 38 out of 40 that supported the death penalty to have a system for indigent defense. We convinced them that if they didn't provide people with a good lawyer, Steve Bright would come to town and overturn whatever they did. And so we now have not only competent counsel, but really decent counsel in Virginia. Of course, that has the addition, it creates a new problem. All of the death penalties that are imposed in Virginia, virtually all of them are upheld. But at least they got a good lawyer and a fair trial, as opposed to what they were getting, all of the stories you've heard about the guilty pleas, the real estate lawyers trying to handle the case, people that didn't know what they're doing, and Steve would come into town and get them all overturned. At least they get a lot of them overturned, not all of them. But at least they got a decent lawyer. That's because of the work that you've done. And so the Georgia system wasn't your first success. You didn't know about the Virginia success, but that you were a motivating force. So your work continues as it must. We should not ignore problems in the criminal justice system any longer. After reviewing the problems in the death penalty prosecutions, and despite voting for death penalties over the years, in 1994, then Supreme Court Justice Harry Blackmun wrote, 20 years have passed since the court declared that the death penalty must be imposed fairly, with reasonable consistency, or not at all. And despite the efforts of the states and the courts to devise legal formulas and procedural rules to meet this daunting challenge, the death penalty remains fraught with arbitrariness, discrimination, caprice, and mistake. Unfortunately, that was a dissenting opinion, but we're making progress, and a lot of others have recognized the futility of trying to impose the death penalty. So I believe it is our responsibility to ensure that people are not mistakenly put to death or deprived of their freedom on account of preventable flaws in our justice system or based on racial prejudice. And Steve, for 30 years, with the Center for Human Rights, has fought tirelessly to bring fairness to the criminal justice system. So thank you, Steve, for all of your hard work on behalf of your defendants that you've represented and on behalf of all of us. Thank you very much.
Thank all of our presenters again. What a wonderful tribute. I think Steve recognized this is just the beginning of so many things that so many people want to say, and I know many of you will be writing him, emailing him, calling him to let him know how you feel. It's hard to put it into one compact evening, but I think that's very important. I have the rare and distinguished privilege of introducing our keynote speaker for tonight, someone who, like me, was, in a sense, very much mentored by Steve as a young lawyer. And I know, and Steve is relatively young. I know people think he's been practicing and been around forever because everyone's had some story about him, but he really is a young man. He's done a very good job. Right, Steve? Right? So that's the story, and he's sticking to it, right? And Brian is someone who exemplifies what it's all about. When you go someplace, you plant a seed. And he planted a seed in Brian that continues to cultivate. And Brian's planted that seed and cultivated remarkable students at NYU and students who work for the Equal Justice Institute, cases before the Supreme Court. It's not recorded, you're not there, but you can even see justices of the Supreme Court with tears in their eyes when they hear Brian argue, because he brings the reality of what's happening, particularly to young people. And that's why he's been such a successful lawyer. There's no surprise that he was one of the recipients of the MacArthur Genius Award as a young man, and he has used his talents at the Southern Center for Human Rights, at the Equal Justice Initiative, at NYU Law School. He takes students back every semester from New York to work in Alabama. He's been in every imaginable jail and prison and courtroom, and he's argued for people. To know that he's really achieved the status of Steve Bright and why it makes it so important. Brian, unlike many of us, like Steve, is willing to be held in contempt by judges. When judges say, "You're in contempt," Brian will say, "You're in contempt too," right? And that's only from Steve Bright. You know, there are locks on judges' doors that they don't want Steve to come in their courtroom. And then Brian comes in with that smile. I'm here. Justice, justice, right? And he's the man who makes it happen. Let's make it happen tonight here at the Southern Center for Human Rights. Please welcome to the stage, folks, Brian Stevenson.
Thank you. Well, this is one of my greatest honors to be in this room celebrating the life of my dear friend, my mentor, my teacher, the person who I really credit for giving me every great opportunity I've experienced since I went to law school is really special. There is no one who I respect more, who I admire more, and who I cherish more than Steve Bright, not just because of all the things you've already heard, but because he's taught me some really basic truths about identity and about our capacity to change the world around us. Law school, in particular, can be really disempowering. You go to law school, and it seems that the prevailing norm and narrative is to teach students that all that idealism they were writing about when they wrote those law school admission essays, all of those great ideas, all of those hopes, all of those dreams about changing the world cannot be achieved. And we're going to complicate everything you believe, and we're going to complicate it with procedure, and we're going to complicate it with doctrine, we're going to complicate it with precedent and decisions from courts. We're going to make you really question whether you can do anything with all of that talent that you brought here. And sadly, it works most of the time. The percentage of students who go to law school saying, "I want to change the world, I want to do public interest," when I was a law student, was about 60%. And when I graduated from Harvard Law School, there were about 5 of us that actually went into that area. And it's largely because our identities get shaped and molded to believe that we can do less than we thought we could do. We can't achieve the things that inspired us to want to be lawyers and advocates. We have to give up on those dreams and aspirations about changing the world. And the reason why I credit Steve and embrace him so dearly is that when I went to Georgia in December of 1983 and met Steve, he did the opposite in a very short period of time. He told me that we can do anything if we push. we can challenge anything. He said, the only thing you have to really believe is that you have to believe things you haven't seen. You have to accept that some of the things that you want to achieve, that some of the things that you want to change have not been achieved yet, haven't been changed yet. They're not visible. The road is not clearly marked, but you still have to embrace it. And I saw him doing this with a whole community of people. Bob Morin is the first person who I lived with. He brought me down there in December and January. I stayed at Bob's apartment, which was in the middle of Midtown Atlanta. It was the most active space for prostitution and drug dealing in Atlanta, Georgia. And I don't know who's practicing in front of Bob, but if he's giving lectures about prostitution and drug dealing, you should know they're informed lectures that he picked up on in Midtown. And then I moved over to Russ Cannon's apartment. You know, I was shifting around and learned so much. And all of these people kept coming to Atlanta. Everybody who knew Steve knew that it was their obligation to help push this identity forward. And so Jerry Fisher would come, and Steve Milliken came, and all of this community of people kept coming, lawyers from law firms. And the importance of identity was really created in the kind of work that Steve did. And there weren't many lawyers in this country doing that. And this identity thing is something I hope we don't forget, because our identity as a community of people, in relationship with the Southern Center for Human Rights, in relationship with Steve, empowers us, but also obligates us. We have to keep fighting to do the things that Steve represents. The best way we honor him tonight is to recognize that this challenge has not been met. The fight is not over. There are important things we have to say. Steve shames people, and I think the shaming practice is something that we have to embrace when it comes to moving justice forward. One of the early things that we did at the Southern Center when I was there, it was right after McCleskey. McCleskey, of course, was a shameful decision by the United States Supreme Court. In 1987, the Supreme Court presented with unbelievable evidence of racial bias in Georgia's death penalty. 22 times more likely to get the death penalty if the defendant is black and the victim is white, 11 times more likely to get the death penalty if the victim is white, no matter what the race of the defendant, 4.3 times more likely to get the death penalty no matter how the data was presented and analyzed by the state of Georgia. And yet, the United States Supreme Court still held that Georgia's death penalty was not unconstitutional. In a shameful decision, the court talked about dealing with racial bias in the death penalty would open the door for lawyers like Steve Bright to come back and complain about race disparities in other kinds of criminal sentencing. And Justice Brennan ridiculed the court's analysis as, quote, a fear of too much justice. And in many ways, he was right. The court was saying this problem of racial bias in the death penalty is too big. And then they said that other despicable thing, shameful thing, that a certain amount of bias, a certain quantum of discrimination is, in the court's opinion, inevitable. And they used that word in that decision. And that law still stands today. And most of us were devastated. Most of us were just unbelievably heartbroken. I'm a product of Brown versus Board of Education. I grew up in a poor community in the South where black children couldn't go to the public schools. And I thought about Brown the day that McCleskey came down. And I couldn't make sense of how the United States Supreme Court, with the words equal justice under law engraved on the side of the building, could be talking about the inevitability of racial bias in the administration of the death penalty. How can you do that? How can a court committed to the rule of law say that? And I started thinking how in 1954, if the court had thought that way, we would not have ended racial segregation in school systems. We would not have created the civil rights movement with a legal architecture empowered to move these things forward. And somehow there was some hopefulness, there was some vision in 1954 that did not exist in 1987, and all of us were devastated. But Steve said, there's language in here that we can do something with. They're talking about faulting the lawyers for not proving that there's an intent to discriminate by not talking about the decision makers in these cases. And he said, we've got to talk about who these people really are. And so we immediately started working on a case in East Georgia, Swainsboro, Georgia, and we said we were going to talk about the decision makers. And Steve fearlessly said, Judge, I'm here to talk to you about who you are, and I need to know some things. I need to know where you send your kids to school. I want to talk about your voting record in the Georgia legislature in the 1960s. I want to know if you've used the N-word. I want to know how many African Americans you've hired as clerks. I want to see what your record is around selecting people of color for juries. And the judge said, you have no right to ask me any of those questions. You can't put me on trial here in a court in this case. And Steve said, oh, yes, I can. McCleskey versus Kemp says that I have to show whether you are prepared to give fair and just treatment to my minority client. And there was some resistance, but we went to the Georgia Supreme Court, and it changed the narrative. We actually began saying that, no, if you're going to impose the death penalty, you're going to have to prove to us you are fair and just. It was the kind of litigation that most people ran from, but Steve embraced it. And changing this narrative is at the heart of what we must do around the death penalty. The death penalty is an issue that continues to condemn not just the people on death row, but all of us. When we execute people, we execute them in the names of the people who reside in that state. And we've executed innocent people. We've executed people because they're poor. We've executed people because they're black. We've executed people because there were political dynamics in the community that required that someone die. We've executed people in states that have never, ever dealt honestly with the legacy of lynching and racial violence and racial inequality. And the real question of the death penalty isn't, do people deserve to die for the crimes they commit? The real question of the death penalty is, do we deserve to kill? And Steve has been trying to make that point for 30 years, trying to show us that you can't have a death penalty if for every 9 people who are executed, 1 person is innocent. You can't do it. That's an unacceptable error rate in a community and a country that says it's about justice. You can't do it. And changing the narrative is part of what we really have to do to honor Steve, to honor his life. There are so many things where the need to change the narrative is critical. We're dealing with mass incarceration in this country. This country has been corrupted by a fear and anger for 40 years. 2.3 million people in jails and prisons today. Nearly 6 million people on probation and parole. We've got an economic model for private prisons and phone providers that insists on keeping incarceration high. And we've got to change the narrative. We've got to tell this country that we need to be setting goals, reducing the prison population by 50% in the next 6 to 10 years, eliminating excessive punishment, confronting these problems of poverty. When you have a criminal justice system that treats you better if you're rich and guilty rather than poor and innocent, you've got to change the narrative. You've got to make a difference about that. And Steve has represented that his whole career. But it's not just the way he taught me and so many of us that our identity matters, because if you're going to shame a system, you have to know who you are. You have to think about what your relationship to that system is. But it's not just that. It's also that he has taught us to be strategic, to be smart, and to appreciate that there are times when the narrative changes by the way we understand basic human dignity. What I love about Steve is that he loves human beings, not just incarcerated people, all human beings. And sometimes he gets accused of not loving innocent people. We even like innocent people, you know. And I say that because in that love, there is a willingness to hear things, to see things. George mentioned this case in Mississippi that Steve did many years ago, the Mary and Mad Dog Pruitt case. When I read the case, I just thought that it can't be right. I went to him and I said, Steve, it says that this man has death sentences in 4 different states. How is that possible? And then it said that he was in a federal witness protection program while he was committing all of these crimes. And then I said, then it says he escaped from prison at one point after he'd been sentenced to death. I said, I don't even understand how someone could achieve all of this misconduct and bad behavior in a short lifetime. And Steve said, no, we're going to represent him. And I remember thinking just how impossible it seemed. And the case got reversed based on Stephen Palmer's incredible litigation. And then they said, we're going to take this case to trial. And I remember just thinking how it would be unimaginable for a jury to return a life verdict in a case like this. But Steve is a brilliant, brilliant lawyer. All of his other skills, I think, are worth reflecting on. But his ability in a courtroom is unparalleled. And he's really, really gifted at understanding how human beings move, how they should think. And I remember talking with him about this case, and the facts were so awful. I mean, it just was awful. But Steve focused on our client's relationship with people after he'd been on death row. And we started talking with the client about all the people he'd been corresponding with, and it turned out that there was an older woman who had been writing Marion Mad Dog Pruitt for several years, who Marion always wrote back. And this woman was an older white woman whose husband of 40 or 50 years had died about 4 years before the retrial. And she just was lonely, and somebody asked her to get involved with a pen pal program. She started writing people in prison, and she ended up writing Marion Mad Dog Pruitt, and he would write her back. And she would write him back. And over the last 4 years, there was this incredible relationship that had developed between this older woman and our client. And Steve understood the power of how that revealed this man's basic humanity, his dignity, his compassion, his capacity for redemption. And I remember thinking all during that trial how impossible it was, but Steve knew exactly what he was doing, and he presented the mitigation case very, very carefully, very thoughtfully. But he understood that his last witness was going to be this older woman. And I remember that examination, and he called this woman to the stand and just had her talk about her life. And she was the kind of person that no one on that jury could ignore. She was like their mother, their grandmother. She was the kind of person that they loved and respected, and they were just captivated by everything she had to say. And then he asked her questions about her relationship to Marion. And when he asked her those questions, she just started smiling. And she said, "Oh, I love Marion. Oh, Marion is just the joy of my life. I write him, he writes me back. I call him, and we speak. I see him. Every day I look forward to the letters that I get from Marion Pruitt." And he just developed this examination that illustrated the capacity of this man on death row to make a difference in the life of this woman. And the last question he asked her, he said, "Well, is there anything you want to say to the jury?" And she said, yes. She turned to the jury and she said, "I've lost the man of my life, the love of my life, my husband of 45 years. And I don't have many people anymore, and I don't have much anymore, but I have Marion." And then she turned to the jury and said, "So please don't take Marion away from me." And we went in a course of a case from a situation where nobody believed that life was possible. And when that examination was finished, and when Steve's closing argument was finished, I don't think anybody doubted that life was the only sentence that would come back. And it happened because he changed the narrative about what it means to be human, about what redemption can do, what reconciliation can do, what recovery can do, what humanity requires us to see even when we want to look away. And then, of course, every lawyer in Mississippi was saying, "Well, if you didn't give the death penalty to Mad Dog Pruitt, you cannot give the death penalty to my client." And for several years, very few people got sentenced to death because Mad Dog Pruitt had become the new standard. Well, changing the narrative is very much what we are called to do if we're going to honor Steve. But it's not just that, it's also understanding the complexity of the law. You know, the work that we do, it's very easy to get involved in this work and just look for the highlights and kind of skim over things and be sort of superficial. But reality is, this stuff is really complicated. The proceduralism that has shaped the death penalty. We have a system in this country that's emerged over the last 20, 30 years where finality is more important than fairness. And this doctrine of proceduralism, procedural default, contemporaneous objection requirements, all of these rules, all of these complex rules that are invoked to keep people from getting justice. Steve had to master all of them. This is not a lawyer who only talks about the big ideas. This is not a lawyer who only understands the grand schemes and thinks in these terms. This is a lawyer who understood all of the doctrine, all of the minutiae, all of the proceduralism, and mastered it in such a way that he could then get us to justice. When Amadeo was argued at the United States Supreme Court, it was ultimately a case about proceduralism. What the court was trying to decide was whether we should consistently apply our rules around procedural default, because the claim of racial bias in this particular case had not been raised when it was supposed to be raised. Steve turned it into a narrative about racial justice. You cannot affirm this conviction and sentence without embracing racial inequality and gross racial injustice. And to get there, we had to understand the procedure, but mostly we had to get the court to recognize the cost of proceduralism, the cost of tolerating a finality doctrine rather than a fairness doctrine. And in that moment, the court essentially abandoned 15 years of precedent to do the right thing in this case, because Steve was able to get them to appreciate what justice requires. Now, to get there, again, you have to understand it. And I say that because Steve teaches his students to be strong and to be vocal and to be vibrant, but he also teaches them to be smart, to know the law. There are no shortcuts. You've got to have not just a vision, but you've got to have real strategy, real tactic, real information in your head. Steve has taught us that, yes, you don't get to justice by just what you know. You don't. You have to be informed, you have to be smart, you have to be strategic, but you get to justice not by the ideas in your mind alone. Those ideas in your mind have to also be fueled by some conviction in your heart. And Steve represents that every day. But that dynamic also means that we have to be smart and be tactical. We've got some big challenges facing us, some incredible opportunities, but some incredible challenges. But if we're strategic and tactical, we can meet those challenges. And finally, what Steve has taught us and taught me is that there is power in witness, in being proximate to inequality, being proximate to injustice, being proximate to all of the ugly things that so many people run from. Steve has recognized and taught me that you can't run away. You've got to run toward. When I went to Georgia, it was like I was being trained in ways that I didn't appreciate. After graduating from law school, I showed up and I actually slept on Steve's couch for about a year. He never told me that this was basically my training for a life of discomfort, cheap houses, no furniture, all of that stuff. We ate in these unbelievably cheap restaurants all over Atlanta, Georgia. People would come to Atlanta and say, well, let's go to this place or let's go to that place. And neither Steve or I knew what they were talking about because we only knew these places that had $2 and $3 entrees on the menu. But in that witness, there was this idea that we could make a difference. We never doubted that we couldn't do things that needed to be done. And Steve taught me that even though it didn't make sense a lot of times, and this proximity to injustice, this proximity to unfairness is something that I most want to celebrate tonight. Because really the difficulty of doing the hard work is that when you get close to these things, it gets painful. It gets overwhelming. Many of you have done these difficult cases. You've taken on death penalty cases. You've taken on huge challenges. And when you do this kind of stuff, it can get really, really painful. We have in Alabama been struggling with an incredible execution rate between 2008 and 2011. We've had the highest execution rate in the country, higher even than Texas with the per capita. And we've just been having executions every other month. And there have been times when I have questioned whether it makes sense to keep doing what we are doing. We get involved in these cases. If you don't have a lawyer prior to an execution, we come in and represent you. And that's the way we used to do it at the Southern Center for Human Rights. Steve would get these calls and say, well, somebody's got a date in Florida, we've got to do something. Somebody's got a date in Virginia, we've got to do something. Somebody's got a date in Mississippi, we've got to do something. We never knew how to say no. And even though it didn't make sense, we said yes. And so we've been trying to honor that witness, honor that legacy, but it's hard. And we had an execution a year ago where the man was scheduled to be executed in 30 days, and we were getting closer to the execution, and I knew we had almost no chance of stopping this execution. And I was thinking about those old days when we would do that kind of work in Atlanta at the Southern Center. And we were getting close to the execution hour, and we had just filed our last stay motion, and it was denied. And I was on the phone with this man talking to him, and he was trying to get his words out. And I'll tell you a quick story. When I was a little boy, my grandmother used to take me to church. And my grandmother was this incredibly formative person in my life. And one day I was at church, and I met this little boy I'd never met before who had a pretty severe speech impediment. And I'd never talked to anybody like that. So I did something really ignorant when I heard this child try to talk. I laughed at him. And my grandmother gave me this look I'd never seen before, and she grabbed me by the arm and pulled me back over, and she said, don't you ever laugh at somebody because they can't get their words out right. Don't you do that. And then she looked at me and she said, now you go back over there and you tell that little boy that you are sorry. And then she said, you go over there and you hug that little boy. And then she said, you go over there and tell that little boy you love him. I said, Mama, I can say I'm sorry, but I cannot go over there and tell that little boy I love him. And she gave me that look again. So I said, okay. And I went over there. I went up to this little boy. I said, look, man, I'm sorry. I was about 9 or 10 years old, and I gave him this kind of little boy man hug. And then I looked at him and I said, and I love you. And I never will forget this little boy hugging me back and whispering in my ear. He said, I love you too. And I was on the phone talking to this man before the execution who was struggling to get his words out. And I had forgotten all about that incident until I was on the phone with this man. And this man was desperately trying to get his words out, but he also had a very severe speech impediment. And the closer we got to execution, the harder it was for him to get his words out. And he was trying so hard, trying and trying. Kept trying, and all he was trying to say was, thank you for doing what you did. Thank you for fighting for us. Thank you for doing what you've done for me, and I love you. But he couldn't get his words out. And it took him about 25 minutes to say something that other people could have said in a minute. And the more he tried, the harder he tried, the more it broke my heart. I was standing there, sitting there, holding the phone, and tears just started running down my face. And I started thinking to myself, how is it that we want to execute this man who is so broken? Why is it that we want to kill all the broken people? Why is it that we have such a hard time seeing basic human dignity in every human being? Why can't we recognize the need to embrace those who have fallen, to talk about redemption for those who have fallen, to find pathways to reconciliation and recovery for those who have fallen? The more I thought about it, the angrier I got, and I had this moment where I said, you know what? I can't do this anymore. Can't do it anymore. It's too hard, too difficult, too hard, too difficult. When I first went to SCHR, I had real questions. Can I do this? And Steve taught me that the question isn't, can you do it? The question is, do you feel like you have to do it? And I realized in that moment that I could not let the execution of this man, whose pain and humanity was so clear to me, cause me to say, I cannot do it. And I started thinking more about why it is that we do what we do. And Steve taught me a lot of things, and I had the great privilege of being close to him and working next to him. And those were the best days of my legal career. And I saw his brilliance, I saw his humanity, I saw his compassion, I saw his wisdom, but I also saw some things that made me understand that maybe I could do something if I stayed close. And I was thinking about that when I started thinking about that man that night, because I was saying, I just don't think I can do this. And I had to ask myself, well, why do you do it? And I thought about the conversations I had with Steve, and I realized from those conversations, I don't do this because I think it's fun. I don't do it because I think it's important. I don't do it because I get to talk to wonderful people like you. I don't do it because there's a community of people who do it. I don't even do it because I'm in colleague and partnership and mentoring with all of these extraordinary people. I realized sitting listening to this man speak to me that night that I do this because not only do I stand with the broken, not only do I advocate for the broken, but I am broken too. And Steve taught me that it's okay to be broken. It's okay to have bruises and scars that were carried out and inflicted when you were dealing with the horrors of racial segregation in your community. It's okay to be confused by the ignorance of others. It's okay to be broken by the anger that you legitimately feel when you see inequality and injustice. Our brokenness is our strength. It is our resource. And Steve has fought through all of these difficulties. I was worried about him when he was having health problems. And we were at some place in Atlanta, Georgia to give a speech, and I was so concerned. And it seemed like he wasn't himself, and he seemed a little weak and a little tired. And he stood up and he said words with such clarity and such power and such truth. I knew that even in brokenness, you can hear things and see things and do things that actually create justice. And it is that legacy that I most want to celebrate. Anybody can serve. Anybody can create justice. Don't leave this space tonight and think that you cannot do something to advance the work of the Southern Center for Human Rights. Don't think you can't do something to honor Steve Bright in the days and weeks and months and years ahead that you have to stand for the poor, to embrace those who are disfavored, to advocate for those who are excluded, to fight for those who are unjustly treated. I think about a couple of people that have made the biggest difference in my life. I was fortunate, even though I grew up in a poor community, I had a mother who loved me like nobody else. And she taught me all these amazing things, and I was thinking about her as I was thinking about these remarks, because she would do these things that I just didn't think was possible. She was a musician. And after I went away to college, she had more time to play with these churches, and she was very good. And she joined this little Baptist church where our community was from and organized a choir, and the choir got very good. And the better the choir got, the bigger the church got. And they moved from a little tiny church to a medium-sized church, and the choir got bigger and bigger, and the better they got, the more people came. And then they went from a medium-sized church to a big church. And every time I went back, I just kept saying, Mom, your choir is just amazing. Y'all are incredible. And people are flocking in. They had to go to 2 services, and then they went to 3 services, and it was just this amazing thing to see. And I said, well, Mom, that's pretty amazing. She said, yeah, it is. And a couple of years had gone by, and in one month she called me. She said, Brian, I want you to come back, and I want you to listen to something that I've been working on at my church. She almost never did that. I said, okay, I don't know when I'm going to get there. She said, well, take your time, but I'm not going to do this until you come back, because this is going to be for you. I said, all right, Mom. And I didn't know what she was talking about, and I kept postponing. And she kept saying, come on back, Brian, come on back. I said, Mom, I'm really busy. We've got all this work. I don't know if I can just come back for the church. She said, no, I want you to do this. And finally, I made this trip to this church back in my community. And she said, the reason why I want you to come here is that when you come, I'm going to have the deaf choir sing. I said, Mom, what are you talking about? I said, you can't have a deaf choir. She said, oh, no, there's a school for the deaf in our community, and they came to me, these kids, and said that they wanted to join the choir. And I said, well, we're going to create a choir just for you all. And she said, I'm not going to let them sing until you come back. And I couldn't believe this. I thought it was some kind of joke. And sure enough, I went to church that Sunday, and the church was packed full of people, and there was on the program something that said deaf choir. And I couldn't imagine it. And finally, we got to that part of the program, and my mother got up, and she says, well, I want to introduce my newest choir. It's a choir I love dearly. And these kids from the School for the Deaf got in front of this congregation, about 15 of them, all ages, and they just stood there and they held hands. And the musicians started to play, and my mom started to play, and just asked everybody to stomp on the floor. And people in the church just started stomping on the floor, and there was this rhythm in that building that you could not resist, and the building almost seemed to be swaying. And these kids who couldn't hear anything began swaying with the rhythm because they could feel this beat. And my mom sort of gave a note and signaled to somebody, and the kids just started singing this song, This Little Light of Mine. It didn't sound particularly good, but everybody jumped in, and for the next 25 minutes, people could not stop singing that song. And I watched these children sing, and they were so happy and so joyful, and it just overwhelmed me. And afterward, I said, Mom, that was really extraordinary. I don't understand how you did that. She said, I just believe things I don't see. And I told these children that if you want to do this, I will do it with you, and I love you all enough to make this work. And I thought about that tonight because I see in this room dozens and dozens of people who have been touched by the life of Steve Bright. And most of us don't have the disabilities that those children have, but many of us have been distracted by things. And you can be disabled by wealth. You can be disabled by prestige. You can be disabled by the promise and the need to do this and to do that. You can be disabled by your other responsibilities. You can be disabled into thinking that you cannot create justice. And I love Steve because, like my mom, he has organized us. He has caused us to believe that we can sing together for justice, even when it doesn't seem possible. That people from firms that can work with people who have never worked in firms, that people who are older can work with people who are younger, people who are black, people who are white, people who are from the South, people who are from the North. If we hold hands together and appreciate what justice requires, we can sing. We can make a difference. We can change the narrative. And Steve has taught us to do that. That's why we're all here. And the exciting thing about that is that we've still got more to do. It is my great privilege to know this man who has been at the heart of so much change, so much justice. And Steve, I'd like to say to you that I know, given everything that you've done, that it is at times overwhelming. I know it's at times exhausting. I think of you often when I think about the story that they were telling at the end of the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955. The city of Montgomery had been off the buses for over a year. And people were getting to the point where they wanted to give up the boycott. And the younger people were saying, we need to give this up because it's not fair to the older people. When I moved to Montgomery, I was surprised at how big and spread out it is. It's not a little tiny town. It's a big spread out place. And when people said they were going to boycott the buses, what they were saying is, we're going to walk 3 miles to work in the morning. Then we're going to work 10, 11 hours all day. Then we're going to walk 3 miles back home at night. It was unbelievable. And when you get to Montgomery, if you've never been there, you appreciate what kind of sacrifice that took, what kind of struggle that took. And after 10, 11 months, people were saying, you know what, this is too hard. And they had a mass meeting at one of the churches, and the younger people were saying, it's not fair to the older people in our community to have to get up and walk 3 miles during the morning and work 12 hours all day and then walk 3 miles back at night. And they were ready to give up the boycott, and this older woman heard them talking this way and got up, and she made it to the front of the church, and she said, don't y'all stop nothing for me. She said, yes, I've got to get up and walk 3 miles in the morning. Yes, I've got to work 10, 11 hours all day. Then she said, I've got to go back and walk 3 miles back home. And yes, it is exhausting, but don't y'all stop nothing for me. I have this vision that I'm going to change things. And I don't even have to sit on the front seat of a bus in Montgomery, Alabama. The idea that I'm walking makes me feel strong. It makes me feel like a different person. And you can't stop if you want. You can stop if you want, but I can't. I got to keep walking. She said, yes, my feet are tired, but my soul is rested. And Steve, I want to say to you tonight, it's been 30 difficult, challenging, but beautiful and powerful years. And I know there are days when your feet are tired. I know there are times when you feel like the challenges that are in front of you and the center are bigger than they're supposed to be, harder than they're supposed to be, and more overwhelming than they're supposed to be. But tonight, we all want to say to you that your soul has resonated with us. You've created this hope, you've created this vision, you've created this passion, and it has made us want to walk. And not just walk by ourselves, but to walk with you. And you should never doubt how much you are loved, how much you are cared for, and how much you are appreciated in the community of people who care about justice. I love you, I thank you, and I appreciate everything you've done, not just for the clients, but for all of us. You've saved lives, but you've also changed lives. And that's why it's my great privilege to share in this experience and to thank you for the 30 years of leadership you've given and to invite you to join us and make your remarks as our devoted, loved honoree. Ladies and gentlemen, Steve Bright.
Thank you very much. Hey, Julia. Mark Twain once said that it always made him feel extremely uncomfortable when people said nice things about him. He was always afraid they would leave something out. I do not think Mark Twain would have any complaint tonight. And I want to thank my dear brother Brian Stevenson, the year that we lived together. If ever there was practicing poverty law, in every sense of the word, and we were basically together 24 hours a day. We talked about everything there was to talk about. We got to know each other as well as you could ever get to know anybody else. And I love you too. And one of the things we've offered our clients has been unconditional love. You know, I was talking to Jimmy Horton the other day. Jimmy Horton was on death row when I went down in 1982, and we just couldn't do it. We just couldn't do his case, and I asked Andrew Lips, if he could take Jimmy Horton's case. And he came down and he helped us, and we ended up finally winning that case in the 11th Circuit. I think it was the last opinion that Frank Johnson wrote. And not too long ago, a year ago, so I applied for parole for Jimmy Horton, and he's now in the community, and he and I talk and have dinner from time to time and talk on the phone, and every time, Jimmy Horton is a great big guy, and he works construction, and he works overtime, and every time he says, I love you, man, I love you, man, I love you, man. And I just thank you so much, Brian and Sia and Bobby Scott. Made me feel so welcome. I don't feel welcome a lot of places I go, but I felt welcome. I feel welcome when I come to the committee, when Bobby Scott's chairing it. Penny White, the great justice of the Tennessee Supreme Court. What I talked about in my article, Judges and the Politics of Death, happened to her, and I've always said, no matter what, the names justice or the words justice and white will always be associated with one another. And how about Gilda Daniels, one of our great lawyers, and great singers and great voices, and I can't thank you enough. And of course, our incomparable director, Sarah Chitanchi. I decided about 7 years ago I was doing a lot of things. I was raising money, I was doing administration, teaching law school, litigating cases. Oh, well, some of this maybe somebody else could do, and we couldn't have anybody better than Sarah Chitanchi. She does it so much better than I do. I want to acknowledge that Ms. Anna Mae Buchanan is here tonight, because we don't ever have a dinner without acknowledging that she's here. And I'm honored by her presence and that of her daughter, Avis Buchanan, who's the head of the public defender. Let me just say a handful of things real quick and we'll go home. We celebrate this evening is the work of an extraordinary administrative staff, investigators, paralegals, and attorneys, students who've spent a week, a month, or a summer, or sometimes even a semester, a year or so at the Southern Center. The members of our board who have not only been involved in our governance and raising money, but in litigating our cases. I want to thank tonight for 30 years of leadership of our board, Charles Ogletree. Charles Ogletree has not only been with us every step of the way, he came in and represented James Ford. James Ford's alive today because of what Charles Ogletree and because of what Brian Stevenson did in representing him. I just cheered him on. I could name all the people on our board, all the lawyers, but I won't do that. I could also talk about other lawyers in our community, Emmett Bondurant and Wilson DuBose, two great lawyers in Atlanta who are here tonight who fought with us for indigent defense. All the people and lawyers and law firms that have worked with us over the years, from large law firms in Atlanta, New York, and Washington, D.C., to single practitioners or little small law firms in places like Blackshear, Georgia, or somewhere in Alabama or Mississippi or wherever it might have been. And we've gained from working with them and vice versa. And just recently, the most recent example of this, and at any time I could give you a different one, but the most recent was the Samuel Gamble, a case that the Southern Center lawyers got reversed, a death penalty case, and recently a team of our lawyers and our friends from the ACLU and David DeBruin and people at Jenner and Block, and this was a case that was going to be retried. This was a case that the death penalty prosecutor in the Alabama Attorney General's office was going to prosecute. There wasn't going to be any plea offer in this case. This case was going to go to trial. We were going to put Samuel Gamble back on death row. But because of, and I won't go into the story, but I'll just say because of the remarkable work that everybody did. Last month that case was resolved, and Samuel Gamble will die in God's time, not in Alabama's time, as a result of that work. And the donations that people have given us, large and small, whatever it is we celebrate this evening, we built it together. We built it through teamwork. And I've often said I have never done anything that I wasn't part of a team for a long time. George Kendall and I and other people, Brian and others, we never tried to do anything on our own. We just teamed up. I've been real fortunate to be on these teams when I was given stewardship of this little program that John Britton and David Lippman brought into existence. No one else was interested in the job. As was alluded to earlier, it's because there wasn't any money to pay you. You know, not a lot of people want a job that doesn't pay anything. And I've always told my students, don't compete for the jobs that everybody wants. Go for the job that nobody wants. You'll probably get it. You know? Bob Morton and I went down, we assessed the situation, we said nobody in their right mind would take that job. So, I mean, we had to take it. And I did write the rent for the first month. We did go a long time without getting paid. But I was so glad to get that job because I had the great privilege of growing up in the Martin Luther King era of American history, from the Montgomery bus boycotts to Dr. King's assassination, and the two lessons we learned from that I did, and I've been so glad I've been able to apply them in my life. One was there's nothing more important than ending racism, poverty, materialism, and militarism, and there's nothing less important than how much money you make doing it. This is a good job for that. I've been lucky in another regard. I just want to mention quickly, I grew up on a little farm in central Kentucky, Danville, Kentucky. Beautiful rolling hills. It's where the vice presidential debate was. You may have read in the New York Times that it has a bakery that makes the best donuts of any bakery anywhere. And I grew up on those donuts. And but when I grew up there, the community was segregated just where Brian grew up, and as segregated as any southern community. Most people wanted it that way. Most white people resisted that. Most people didn't want any change, or if they wanted anything, they didn't want to be involved at all. And I've said this before, and I'll say it just tonight because my family is here, and I'm so delighted they are. more I look at it, the more remarkable it is to me that my parents, my father a farmer, my mother a homemaker, that at the time when our community was struggling over racial segregation, racial justice, they were a part of change. They were a part of racial justice, and for them there wasn't anything complicated about it. It was just that it wasn't right to treat people differently because of the color of their skin. It's a simple, straightforward, obvious lesson, but it was lost on so many people then, and it's been lost on so many people today. I wish my father could be here, but he is no longer in life. I wish my godson and my nephew, Benjamin Bright Moran, who was killed at age 18, could be with us tonight. He's not, but we remember him on these occasions. We remember him. But I am honored that my mother is here tonight, Patricia Bright. My sister, Benjamin's mother, and her husband, Dan Moran. My sister, Sally, who was the liaison to the Biden campaign during the debate, and I was glad Hunter Biden, the vice president's son, dropped by a minute ago, and I was glad he said they did a good job. My brother, Jim Bright. And my three favorite nieces, Julia, Sarah, and Trish, are all here tonight. Along with my cousin Jane Rutherford and her husband Rick. Thank you all so much. It means so much that these people came so far to be here with me tonight, just as Jeannie Woodford. I can't thank you for coming all the way from California. Meredith Hightower from coming all the way from Los Angeles. And other people who've come here and been a part of this. I just want to say this too real quickly. I was very fortunate to benefit from the land-grant universities. I got a great education at the University of Kentucky and the University of Kentucky Law School. President Lincoln started the land-grant universities so that people like me could go to law school and be a lawyer. Somebody grew up on a farm. That my sister could be a doctor. That my sister could be a journalist. It's a government program that worked tremendously well for me. My tuition in law school is $250 a semester. I'm honored that Dean Brennan, the dean of the UK Law School, is here with us tonight. And I will just say this. When I started, I had the example of my first boss. John Rosenberg had been in the voting rights section of the Department of Justice. He had gone to the South to try to end the poll tax and to end literacy tests so that black people could vote. And the people in Mississippi and Alabama and other states that he worked in had fought a civil war to keep that from happening. But John Rosenberg went down there with John Doerr and other people and got voting rights for people in the South. And then this gifted man who could have done anything went to the coal fields of Appalachia and set up a legal services program. And that's what we did in Atlanta, Bob and I, when we went down. We set up a program where we said if good people, people of goodwill, want to come together and want to help people with the death penalty, help people that are in prison, help people that are in debtor's prison, whatever, all these issues that we deal with. If you want to come and work together and not make any money doing it, but do it because it's worth doing, as Brian talked about. This is a place you can come and do that work. And it's a very self-selecting group because it didn't pay anything. And yet we got the most remarkable, the most brilliant, the most dedicated people in every position that we have. We've had people who've come to us as interns and then come back as investigators and then come back as lawyers. We have two people like that on staff, and I'm delighted to announce tonight that Crystal Redd, who many of you know because she was at the Public Defender Service, and then she was at our office as an investigator for many years. Then she taught third grade in Atlanta for 7 years. She's about to graduate, a presidential scholar at Harvard Law School, and she's coming back. Coming back next time. One person has been with us 25 years, Mary Brown Sinclair, who's here, we've acknowledged. Just one other person I'll mention who's been one of the great gifts of my life when she came 20 years ago as an administrative assistant and then became our office manager and now our finance manager, Julia Robinson Hicks. When Jeannie and her group at Death Penalty Focus asked us to come out and accept an award in California, I asked Julia and Patricia Hale, our administrative assistant, is not here tonight because she said like the works behind the scenes. She's back at the office, but I took them there. And I said, these are the people that have worked and have made this happen. This is one thing we did at this office, is there's no hierarchy between the administrative staff and the investigators and the paralegals and the lawyers. And I've often said about Julia, we've never, ever, in all the time we've worked together, we've never had a crossword. Never a crossword. Preparing for hearings, preparing for trials, filing briefs, pleadings, seeking stays of execution, sometimes getting stays, sometimes not getting stays. And we've done this generally in the way we've done our work. Calm, cool, collected, respectful to one another, thoughtful about it. We were no drama long before Obama, I'll tell you that. It's been a family. It's been a diverse family. We've always had more women than men. We've had a number of people of color. Gilda Daniels was one, and many others. Carla Friend, who joined us in 1983, I saw here tonight. We have 3 African-American women on staff now, and it's been a marvelous group of people. I want to just finally say Charlotta Norby, who came to the Prettyman program, Johnny's program, as a lawyer in 1989 after 2 summers as a student with us when she was at NYU. A brilliant career in the law was cut short by an aneurysm in 1995 when aneurysm exploded in her brain. But even with that injury, even with the grand mal seizures that she had at any unpredictable time after that, she got on an airplane all by herself and flew to Little Rock, Arkansas, and argued William Francis Bowen's case in the Arkansas Supreme Court. She won that case, got reversed, and she recruited a great lawyer from New York to come down and retry it, and William Francis Bowen will die in God's time, not in Arkansas's time. Ultimately, she turned to other things, to quilting, to the Humane Society, to working with prisoners, and teaching dogs and training them. Good for the prisoners, good for the dogs, good for the people that have those animals as their companions. And for 23 years has provided the support and love that has sustained me as my partner in this struggle. And I'm immensely grateful. And finally, I just want to say this. I want to thank each and every one of you. I want to thank you for being here tonight. You have sustained us with your contributions, but you have sustained us in our spirit with your support. You have helped us carry on in a multitude of ways. The loneliest time I ever had in my life was when I was in an execution chamber where the only person in there with me, besides my client, was the father of the victim. Everybody else was a police officer. And I watched James David Rollerson when he was put to death. Just 10 days earlier, I had watched Joseph Carl Shaw when he was put to death. And when the execution of James David Rollerson was over, the police officers all were giving each other high fives. They were cheering. They were clapping. This is my client. This is the man that I'd come to love and know, who had just been snuffed out. Of course, there was still work to be done. There was still a mother to be comforted. There was still things to do in that case. But it was the loneliest moment I think I've ever had. I always work with teams, but that was the loneliest moment. Tonight, I'd have to say, whatever, same kind of questions Brian talked about can we go on? Can this cup be passed? Do we really have to do this? This was my 3rd year, 1985, my 3rd year at the center, 2 executions, 10 days apart. And then Bob Moore and I, the next Monday, had to be in Mississippi in Biloxi to argue Kenneth Wheat's case or have an evidentiary hearing. United States District Court. You sustained us through all this. And tonight, I have felt with so many people, my students, with all of you who've been a part of our work in so many ways. There's not a person here who hasn't been a part of our work in some way. And I just want to thank each and every one of you for being here, for supporting what we've done, for helping us in our way bring a little bit of justice to the darkest parts of the country. I look forward to the next 30 years. And good Lord willing, the creek don't rise. I'll see you in 30 more years, all right? Thanks.
Steve, let all of us just thank you for what you've done. And this has been a very tough year for all of us. This is a year following our being here in Washington, D.C. and lamenting the death of Troy Davis in Georgia. It's the year that the folks in California worked incredibly hard to try to get an initiative to get rid of the death penalty in a state that has the most people on death row and change it with life without the possibility of parole. And yet we still have this joy because we know that it's better than it was and it's going to get better. And I want to say a special thank you to your mother, because she had to do something a long time ago, because I know Steve was precocious, arrogant, wouldn't listen, but every single time, everything you and your husband said, he gained something from it. And somehow, before he was old enough to say mommy and daddy, he learned the word justice. And he's practiced that all of his life. And so I want to thank a family for letting Steve stand on your shoulders and do what he does today. I'll say three things in closing. One, this day forward, Steve, you're going to be known as Saint Steve. Now, I know you say, wait a minute, but I think about, if you go back to the Bible, the 2 Timothy, the 4th chapter, the 7th verse, it's about St. Paul. And he reminds me a lot of you. It was a long time ago. I didn't know him personally, but he reminds me a lot of you. He was beaten, he was disgraced, he was jailed. And here's what he said just before he was about to die as a saint. He says, I have fought the good fight. I have followed my course and finished my course. And yet I have kept the faith. And I just think about you, Steve, the whole idea that you have fought the good fight and you haven't finished your course, but you've kept the faith. And that's what makes so many people so strong today. And I say this, there's a counter narrative to what we've been hearing. Everybody's been saying, Steve, thanks for 30 years. We want to see you 30 more years. I'm not saying that. You've been showing us for 30 years what you want us to do. And the idea is that you've been teaching us what it means to understand justice and why we can't wait for you to argue the next case or fight the next fight or write the next brief or go before the next court or get held in contempt and go to jail. You've done that. You've done all of those things. And I say it's time for you to say, as I would say to you, well done. And that we should lift up what you have raised for 4 decades as a fighter for justice. Finally, let me say this. We're going to hear a closing song from Gilda Daniels, who in her own right, a great lawyer with the Southern Center for Human Rights, a great lawyer for civil rights and Department of Justice, and a wonderful vocalist. But it's this that makes this so important. When people are thinking, we need money. There's no question that the Southern Center for Human Rights needs money. And you know what? We're going to keep doing it if you don't give us a nickel, right? I know that as the chairman of the board for 30 years, not because I wanted to be, but because I had to be, right? every time we doubled the salaries of the staff, behind our back, Steve cut the salaries in half and hired twice as many more people. That's genius. I mean, the whole idea is that poverty is his middle name. And so we don't expect you to change that, what you can do. And everybody has envelopes on the table. I'm not going to ask you to hold them up today, but take them with you. And just think about 30 years and what it means. I know you've given. I know you've been generous. I know you've been supportive. Everybody can't take a death penalty case, can't go to a prison, can't represent someone who has all these challenges, doesn't have a whole lot of money. But whatever you can do, even talking to a friend about this, I think would be very important. And I think of Steve with the same spirit he had today that he had in classes at the University of Kentucky decades ago, at the Public Defender decades ago, at the Law Students in Court decades ago, at the Southern Center for Human Rights decades ago. And the same energy you saw him in the Supreme Court, and you'll see him as he leaves here and as he's talking about everybody, how important it is. It reminds me of James Cleveland and a song that he had that sort of, I think, captures what you're all about, Steve, and why this is the largest, most successful event we've ever had for the Southern Center for Human Rights. He said, I don't feel no ways tired. He says, I've come too far from where I started from, and nobody told me that the road would be easy, but I don't believe he brought me this far just to leave me. And I think that's the song you're singing to all of us. You don't feel tired because you know we didn't help bring you this far just to leave you. And I hope that this will be a celebration not just of 30 years of dedication, but a lifetime of commitment to justice. That's what you represent. And I salute you, Steve Bright, Saint Steve Bright. Thank you. I don't know what you folks are going to give or if you're going to give, but Sarah, I want to support as my last effort as the chairman of the board, give another check for $5,000 for the Southern Center for Human Rights, and I hope people will match it, support it, and do what they can. Not just in this room, but I think that's very important. Where's Barbara? I know Barbara's collecting money. There'll be people at the door. She'll say, Tree, can you give it tonight? Yes, I brought my checkbook, Barbara. So I think that's what it's all about, the idea that we're going to make a difference. And to make sure that you're in the right spirit, let me bring to the stage as we end this wonderful celebration a wonderful lawyer, person, civil rights leader, a person who believed in God deeply, and a wonderful vocalist. Please welcome back to the stage as we end, Gilda Daniels.
Thank you. Wow. We had church tonight. We had Pastor Ogletree, Reverend Stevenson. I'm an associate professor at the University of Baltimore School of Law, and I think my dean was here. Ron White is here. And we certainly have work to do as a community. And this song that Sarah asked for, We Who Believe in Freedom Cannot Rest, is really the anthem for everyone who's working on civil rights and human rights. And since this is a church and you are a congregation, this is our congregational hymn that we'll walk out on. So I need you all to clap like this. And if you know the words to the song, you can certainly sing the song. Slow down. We who believe in freedom cannot rest. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes. We who believe in freedom cannot rest. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes. Until the killing of black men, black mothers' sons is as important as the killing of white men, white mothers' sons. We who believe in freedom freedom cannot rest. You can sing. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes. Everybody, we who believe in freedom cannot rest. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes. Here's the verse. Until the killing of black men, black mothers, sons, is as important as the killing of white men. White mothers, sons, sing it with me. We who believe freedom cannot rest. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes.
All right, justice it is. Congratulations, Steve Bright. 30 years. Let's do it. Amen. Good night.